On Easter Sunday, 1842, in the red clay of a Georgia plantation, 3 overseers vanished into a well. They had not fallen. They had been forced down, drowned in the dark by the hands of a woman no one thought capable of such wrath. The plantation was already heavy with rot before that day. The slave quarters reeked of sweat and mildew, wooden walls scratched with names of children sold, prayers carved in secret, curses left unfinished. The fields stretched endless and cruel, rows of cotton like white teeth biting into bent backs. Nights brought no rest, chains clanked in the dirt, overseers barked orders even in dreams, and the whip left echoes that never died. She lived in that suffocating world. They called her Dinah. Small, quiet, her skin dark as the soil she was forced to till. Years of humiliation had pressed her shoulders low, but her eyes burned with something no lash could kill. Dinah had lost more than time in bondage. A baby taken from her arms before it could walk. A brother whipped until he never rose again. Each memory clung to her ribs like iron hooks. It was on Good Friday that the breaking point came. One overseer, drunk and laughing, dragged her into the yard as the others watched. They stripped her bare, bound her to a post, and whipped her until flesh peeled, until blood pooled at her feet like spilled wine. When they tired, they spat and left her half-conscious in the dirt. That night she whispered to herself, voice cracked and low, "No more." The other slaves heard her. They gathered by the graves at the edge of the quarters, where broken stones leaned like crooked teeth. There an old man read the soil as if it were scripture. He said the earth demanded blood, that the land would not rest until it drank from those who had tormented it. A child, feverish with cough, muttered that the well was hungry, that it wanted men instead of water. Whispers spread in the dark. They began to conspire. Knives stolen from the kitchen, ropes hidden beneath floorboards, bitter herbs ground fine to dull the overseer's strength. Each one carried their own wound. A daughter violated, a son sold, a father buried without a name. Dinah listened, silent, her face lit by the faint glow of tallow candles. When she finally spoke, the room fell still. "We put them in the well," she said. "We bury them where they cannot climb back." On Easter morning, as the masters feasted and prayed, the overseers staggered back from drink, smug and careless. Dinah lured them one by one, telling them the bucket had jammed in the well, that water was needed for the house. When the first leaned over, a rope tightened around his throat, and hands pushed hard. His scream was swallowed by the stone throat of the earth. The second fought, cursing, clawing, until a sharpened stake pierced his side. He tumbled in after the first. The third was dragged, his nails bleeding as he grasped the rim. Dinah herself pried his fingers loose, eyes locked with his, as he fell into the black water below. The plantation woke to silence. No overseers, only the well, sealed with its secret. The masters whispered of demons, of curses, of God's wrath on Easter. The slaves said nothing, but when they passed the well, they walked slower, heads high, as if the ground itself had shifted. This was no accident. This was a trial carried out in darkness, a judgment written not on paper, but in water and stone. And for the first time, the earth did not only remember their suffering, it remembered their vengeance. The well became a wound in the earth, and every day that passed after Easter, it bled silence. No one went near it. The masters ordered new buckets of water, drawn from a creek half a mile away. They muttered about accidents, about drunken men stumbling, but their voices trembled. No one dared lower a rope into that black mouth again. The disappearance of 3 overseers at once was not something a plantation could hide. By the week's end, riders came from neighboring estates, faces pale, pistols heavy at their sides. They walked the grounds, eyes darting at the fields, sniffing the air as if they could smell rebellion. The big house filled with whispers of Haiti, of Nat Turner, of the devil rising in Georgia's red soil. The slaves heard those whispers. They bent their backs in the fields, kept their heads low, but inside, their hearts were beating differently. Something had cracked in the order of things. Overseers were not supposed to vanish, slaves were not supposed to strike back. And yet the well stood as proof that both were possible. The masters tightened control. Chains grew heavier, rations grew smaller, nights became longer with sudden raids on the quarters. Men with lanterns barged in, dragging children from their mats, demanding confessions, but no one spoke. Not a single tongue betrayed Dinah or the others. The silence of the quarters was thicker than iron. The masters mistook it for fear. It was not fear. Dinah herself bore the scars of that silence. Her back was still raw, her steps still stiff, but her eyes never dimmed. In the evenings when the fields emptied and the guards grew drunk, she sat among the others at the edge of the graveyard. They spoke in hushed voices, broken English mingled with words older than America, An old woman scattered ashes in a circle and said the well was now a grave, a holy place where the spirits of the drowned would be chained forever. A boy with eyes too old for his years whispered, "The water is red now." And yet, the work of vengeance had not finished. The conspirators knew it. Each of them carried a hunger that one act could not satisfy. The death of 3 overseers was justice, but justice was not freedom. The master still lived, still ruled, still prayed loudly in his house while women wept quietly in the fields. The plan grew in the dark, in breaths stolen between blows of the hoe and gulps of muddy water. Dinah no longer needed to lead with words. Her presence alone was command. She had been broken, and she had risen. Now the others watched her with a kind of reverence, as if she had become something more than flesh. Each conspirator offered what they had: an old field hand, sharpened stones until they gleamed like glass. A woman who gathered herbs brewed a powder to make a man's stomach turn inside out. Children learned to slip through shadows, to steal nails and iron scraps. Even songs took on new meaning. Hymns hummed in the fields, carried hidden signals, verses bent into warnings, rhythms turned into plans. Meanwhile, inside the big house, fear grew like mold. The master locked his doors at night. He kept pistols close, prayed longer, drank harder. He told his guests it had been an accident, yet he watched every movement of the slaves with suspicion. When a shovel clanged in the field, he flinched. When laughter flickered in the quarters, he thought it mockery. His world had been pierced, and he could not seal the hole. One night, as thunder rolled far off in the Georgia sky, the master walked past the well. He stopped, lantern trembling in his hand. The wind sighed through the trees like a groan from the earth. He thought he heard water move, though no bucket had touched it since Easter. He leaned closer, whispering a prayer under his breath. Then came a sound, faint, hollow, but clear. A splash, a cough, a man's gurgle. His lantern shook so hard the flame nearly died. He stumbled back, muttering, "The devil's in there." He never passed that way again. The slaves heard of his terror, and they knew the well was now theirs, not just as a grave, but as a weapon. It had swallowed 3 overseers without spitting them back. It could swallow more. Dinah stood by it one night, her hand resting on the stone rim. The moon shone silver on her scars. She whispered into the blackness, words that only the earth could hear. "It ain't done. It won't be done till he's down there too." From that night, the conspiracy sharpened. They began to count the nights until the Feast of Pentecost, when guests would flood the plantation, and the master would drink himself blind in the great hall. That would be the night, and the well, hungry and waiting, would have its fill again. By Pentecost, the plantation was a stage set for celebration, but beneath its polished veneer, every corner reeked of unease. The big house gleamed with new whitewash, the fields bent under the strain of fresh planting, and wagons rolled in from neighboring counties, carrying guests who came to eat, drink, and reassure themselves that the order of slavery still stood firm. But in the quarters, whispers moved faster than the wind. For those who bent their backs in the soil, this feast was not a celebration, it was an opening. The masters boasted of God's blessings. They prayed over the crops, the livestock, the white children in fine linen, but they did not pray for the enslaved. To the enslaved, Pentecost had always meant extra labor, swollen feet, and sleepless nights cooking for men who would never call them human. Yet this year, it meant more. It meant a reckoning sharpened in silence. Dinah had become the center of it all, not because she sought leadership, but because pain had carved her into something the others followed without question. She did not smile, she did not beg, she carried the memory of Easter in her eyes, and when those eyes met another slave's across the rows of cotton or over a bucket of water, they carried a command more binding than any spoken word. Wait, watch, be ready. The tools of vengeance gathered slowly. A kitchen boy smuggled out a cleaver, hidden beneath floorboards. A woman assigned to laundry cut strips of cloth to use as gags and bindings. An old blacksmith, forced to mend plows by day, fashioned hooks from broken iron teeth at night. Even children joined in. They slipped nails into their pockets, left doors ajar, and learned how to run messages through song. The plan took shape as carefully as any sermon. First, the wine would be laced, a handful of bitter root, ground into powder so fine it left no taste, stolen from the herb woman's bundle. Second, the lanterns in the hall would be doused at the chosen signal, plunging the feast into darkness. Third, when confusion spread, knives, stones, and ropes would speak louder than any hymn, and when the screams died, when the last guest slumped lifeless or gagged in fear, the master would be dragged to the well. Each conspirator had a reason that burned hotter than the torches they prepared. Ezekiel, an elder whose son had been whipped to death for dropping a sack of corn. Ruth, whose infant was buried in a shallow grave behind the kitchen. Jonah, who still bore scars on his wrists from irons so tight they cut to the bone. Each name, each wound was folded into the plan like pages in a holy book. But vengeance carried a price, and it stalked them even before the first blow was struck. On the night before the feast, Ward, one of the younger overseers recently brought to replace the drowned, wandered close to the quarters. He heard low voices, a rhythm of whispers and chants. He paused, suspicion narrowing his pale eyes. But then the voices rose into song, a hymn about Jordan's river, soft and slow. He spat and turned away, muttering about savages. The hymn had saved them. Beneath its melody, the plan had been spoken again, every detail tested. When Pentecost came, the air itself felt heavy, like a storm swollen but refusing to break. Guests arrived in carriages, laughter spilling out with the smell of tobacco and brandy. Women in lace fanned themselves on the porch while men praised the master's fields, the neat rows of cotton, the obedient workers bending in the heat. The master, flushed and sweating, raised his glass in the great hall, proclaiming that God had favored him with prosperity. Dinah moved among them, carrying trays of food, her scars hidden beneath coarse cloth. Her hands were steady, but her heart drummed like war in her chest. She watched every movement, how deep they drank, how slow their eyes blinked. She knew the poison would not kill quickly. That was not its purpose. It would soften their bodies, dull their limbs, make them slow when the darkness fell. The well waited outside, its stones cold, its mouth silent. The slaves passed it as they carried buckets to the kitchen, each glance a silent vow. Tonight it would not remain silent. Tonight it would speak with a voice of water and death. As the feast swelled with noise, the conspirators moved into place. Ruth slipped toward the stables to loose the horses when the signal came. Jonah stood by the side door with the cleaver beneath his ragged coat. Ezekiel hummed the hymn under his breath, fingers tracing the scar on his wrist like it was scripture. And Dinah, standing just beyond the glow of the great hall, whispered into the dark, "When the lamps fall, so does he." The hour of blood was near. The Pentecost feast burned hot and loud inside the master's great hall. Laughter ricocheted off the plastered walls. The crack of glasses striking together rose above the din, and every breath of tobacco smoke seemed to thicken the air. The table sagged under roasted pork, sweet pies and jugs of brandy that never emptied. Guests sat fat and red-faced, their collars loosened, their words slurred, but behind the clatter of silver and the drunken boasting, something darker moved, quiet and deliberate. Dinah carried a pitcher of wine between the tables, her bare feet silent on the polished floor. Her eyes flicked across the room, counting. She saw the master, bloated and sweating at the head of the table, his lips slick with grease, his hand gripping a glass that would not leave his reach. She saw Ward, the new overseer, sharp-eyed even in drink, his whip coiled by his chair. And she saw the others, neighbors, planters, men who carried the smell of blood from their own fields. Each face was a wound carved into her memory. Each one tonight would become a corpse. The powder had already been mixed. When she leaned to refill a cup, her hand tilted slightly, the bitter root dissolving into the wine unnoticed. No one questioned her. To them she was nothing but a servant, faceless and voiceless. They did not know that the very hands that poured their drink had already written their death. In the kitchen, Jonah gripped the cleaver under his ragged coat, sweat running down his temples. He had chopped wood with it for weeks to mask its edge, but tonight it gleamed sharp enough to split bone. Ezekiel stood by the door, his old hands clutching a length of iron he had filed into a hook. His lips moved silently in prayer, not for forgiveness, but for strength. Ruth waited in the stables, her fingers on the latch, ready to scatter the horses into the night when the signal came. The signal was fire. Dinah passed through the hall again, her tray empty now. She glanced at the lanterns, glass globes hanging from iron hooks along the walls. Each flame burned steady, golden, fragile. She caught Jonah's eye as he lingered in the doorway. He nodded once, then lifted a small pouch of powder from his belt. He scattered it across the nearest lamp as if brushing away dust. Within seconds, the flame sputtered, flared, then died. Darkness licked the corner of the hall. The guests roared in drunken protest, but before they could rise, a second lamp went out, then a third. In moments, the hall was plunged into blackness, broken only by the faint orange of the hearth. The slaughter began in that dark. A scream tore the air, a man's voice cut short as Jonah's cleaver split skull. Another cry followed, choked by cloth as two women pressed gags against their masters' mouths. The sound of glass shattered, then the wet thud of bodies hitting the floor. Confusion swallowed the hall. The poisoned wine had done its work. Men staggered, their legs heavy, their arms slow, their eyes wide with fear. Dinah's hand found Ward in the chaos. He had risen fast, whip unfurling, but she lunged with a rope, wrapping it around his throat. He swung, struck her shoulder, but she held on. Others rushed in, pulling him down. His boots scraped across the floor, his breath rattled, until finally, with one violent jerk, the rope bit deep. His body went still. The air was thick now with iron and smoke, the smell of blood rising like steam. In the corner, a planter crawled toward the door, his hands slipping in the gore. Ezekiel's hook caught him by the ankle, dragging him back across the boards. His nails scraped splinters, his mouth foamed with terror, but Ezekiel's arm did not falter. The hook sank again, and the man screamed no more. The hall was no longer a place of feast but a pit of judgment. Every blow, every stab, every choking gasp was a sentence read aloud by the enslaved. The women moved with quiet fury, pressing knives into flesh, covering mouths before cries could escape. The children, hidden in the shadows of the doorway, watched wide-eyed, not with fear, but with a strange, solemn awe. They were witnessing the earth itself reclaiming justice. At the head of the table, the master struggled to rise. His fat arms shook, his face red and shining with sweat. He shouted for order, for God, for soldiers who were not there. He stumbled, spilling wine across his shirt, but before he could flee, Dinah stood before him. Her face was lit by the dying fire, her scars raw in the glow. "You prayed," she said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut the din. "Now listen to the prayer answered." She seized his arm. Others rushed to her side. They bound his hands, gagged his mouth, dragged him from his chair. His boots kicked against the boards, his curses muffled, his eyes rolling in disbelief that his slaves had risen against him. The doors to the hall burst open, and the night air swept in, thick with smoke and ash. Outside, Ruth had loosed the horses, their hooves thundering into the fields, their shrill cries echoing through the dark. Flames licked the stables now, fire racing along dry timber. The sky above the plantation glowed red. The master was hauled across the yard, his body heavy but helpless, toward the well, the same well where 3 overseers had vanished on Easter. Its mouth gaped wide, black and waiting. The conspirators circled. Their breaths came ragged, their hands slick with blood, but their eyes shone with something fierce, unbreakable. Dinah stepped forward, pulling the gag from his mouth. "Speak," she hissed. "Name what you've done." He gasped, spat, stammered about law, about property, about God's wrath. His voice cracked with terror, not authority. No one answered. They only stared. Dinah raised her hand. "The earth remembers. Now it takes you." And with one final heave, they pushed him forward. His scream echoed once. Then the sound of water swallowed him whole. The well closed its mouth with silence. The master's scream sank into the well, and the night went quiet, but only for a breath. Then the plantation erupted. The flames Ruth had set to the stables leapt high, devouring timber, hay, and tack. Horses shrieked as they bolted into the fields, their manes catching sparks, their hooves drumming the earth like war drums. The fire spread to the sheds and barns, each dry beam snapping with the hunger of long dry wood. Within minutes, the plantation was no longer a place of order, but a pyre. The enslaved gathered in the yard, their faces lit by firelight, their chests heaving with the first taste of freedom that was not just whispered but real, standing before them in smoke and ruin. Some wept, some laughed, some simply stood stunned, as though afraid to move lest the vision dissolve. Children clung to their mothers, watching the sky turn red. The smell of blood mixed with burning timber, and the air itself seemed to groan. But the night was not theirs alone. Riders from the neighboring estate had seen the glow. Distant shouts cut across the fields. Dogs barked. The heavy beat of hooves announced that white vengeance was already on its way. Dinah's voice cut through the chaos. To the swamp. They moved fast. Mothers grabbed children. Men lifted the weak, and the conspirators herded the group away from the inferno. Ezekiel leaned on Jonah's arm, his face pale but his jaw set. Ruth carried her youngest against her hip, the child wide-eyed but silent. Dinah led, her back straight despite the lashes that still burned across her shoulders. Behind them, the plantation collapsed. Beams crashed into the flames. The big house belched smoke, its white columns blackening and cracking as though the land itself rejected them. The well stood untouched in the yard, its mouth smoking like a wound, its secret sealed in water. The swamp welcomed them with mud, mosquitoes, and darkness. Cypress roots twisted from the water like gnarled fingers, and the air was thick, wet, and heavy. But to the rebels it was sanctuary. The masters feared the swamp, called it cursed, said men who entered never returned. For the enslaved, it was freedom's border. They moved deeper, their steps muffled by wet earth. The sounds of pursuit grew behind them, dogs baying, men shouting, the crack of whips even in the hunt. A shot rang out, its echo chasing them through the trees. The group dropped low, hearts pounding, but no one fell. Dinah raised her hand, steady, commanding silence. They pressed on. Hours passed. Some stumbled, their legs raw from briars, their lungs burning. Children whimpered, but were hushed with gentle hands. The swamp swallowed them, its shadows hiding their bodies, its waters masking their scent. The dogs howled on the edges, but dared not plunge deeper. The riders cursed and fired into the night, but their bullets struck only trees. At dawn, the fugitives huddled on a rise of dry land where moss dripped from the branches like shrouds. The swamp was alive with insects and the croak of unseen throats, but it was safer than the fields they had left in flame. Here, for the first time, they breathed without chains. Ezekiel spoke, his voice ragged. "We killed them. We burned it. Ain't no turning back." No one answered. They knew the price. Soldiers would come. Some of them would die. But slavery, for them, had already ended the moment the master's scream vanished into the well. Dinah looked across the water, her face carved hard by firelight and exhaustion. She saw not just the swamp, but something further, an opening, a road no longer chained to the whip. "They'll hunt," she said. "They'll hunt until the swamp takes us, or we take ourselves further. But we don't bow. Not now, not ever again." The group sat in silence, the fire of the plantation still glowing faint behind the trees, the future unknown. Yet in the mud, in the stench, in the hunger, they felt something new rising among them. Not hope, not yet, but defiance. And in the reeds, half hidden by fog, an old woman whispered a prophecy. "The land remembers blood. Tonight it drank full. Tomorrow it will demand more." The swamp became both shield and tomb. For days the fugitives moved through its black water, their bodies bitten by insects, their skin raw from mud and cuts. The cypress canopy blotted out the sun, turning every hour into twilight. Hunger gnawed at them. Children cried softly against their mother's shoulders. But the greater sound, the one that kept them from rest, was the echo of dogs baying at the swamp's edge. The militia had come. The fire at the plantation had been seen for miles, and by sunrise the countryside was alive with white vengeance. Armed riders scoured the roads. Notices were nailed to trees promising reward for capture, dead or alive. Soldiers from the nearest garrison joined the hunt, their boots stamping the very soil the slaves had tilled. They called Dinah and the others demons, rebels, blasphemers against God's order. They swore to hang them in chains at the crossroads as warning. But the swamp did not easily give up what it claimed. The riders cursed when their dogs refused to plunge into the muck. Shots fired into shadows struck only mist. They sent men knee-deep into water, but the swamp devoured them with snakes and sucking mud. Each night the pursuers built campfires on the high ground, their flames flickering like eyes in the dark. Each night, Dinah and her band watched in silence, their bodies hidden by reeds, their breath shallow. Not all survived. On the fourth night, little Ruth's baby burned with fever. The swamp water was foul, and no herb could cool the child. The mother rocked her until the small body went still in her arms. She did not weep loudly. She kissed her child's face, laid it beneath a cypress root, and whispered, "Better here in the mud than in their chains." The group buried the infant in silence, the swamp closing over the mound as though it had always been there. The next morning soldiers closed in. Shots cracked through the trees. Jonah fell, clutching his chest, blood seeping between his fingers. Ezekiel tried to lift him, but Dinah pulled the old man away. "He's gone," she hissed. Jonah gasped once more before sinking into the mud. The water swallowed him without a ripple. Behind them, men shouted, their boots splashing closer. They scattered. Some fled deeper. Some vanished into reeds. Some never reappeared. Ezekiel was caught days later, dragged back to town, his body hanged in chains until crows picked him clean. Ruth was cornered near the riverbank. She slit her own throat rather than be taken. The militia told the story as madness. Among the enslaved, it became courage. Dinah endured. She slipped further into the swamp, moving by night, guided by stars when they showed, by instinct when they did not. She carried no child, no bundle, only her scars and her will. Rumors spread among the planters that she had been killed, that her body lay in the mud. Yet others swore she still walked, her shadow moving through the trees, her voice whispering in the night winds. The years that followed buried the revolt in silence. The masters rebuilt the house, hired new overseers, planted new rows of cotton. They forbade any mention of Easter or Pentecost on the plantation grounds, but whispers could not be chained. Around the fires in the quarters, children leaned in as the elders spoke. They told of Dinah, the woman who drowned 3 overseers in a well. They told of the Pentecost feast turned to slaughter, of the master dragged screaming into the earth. They told of flames rising against the Georgia sky, of slaves vanishing into the swamp like smoke. Some said Dinah lived to old age, hidden among maroons in the deep woods, her body scarred but unbroken. Some said she was taken by the swamp itself, her spirit bound to the waters, dragging down any overseer who dared cross. Others swore she still appeared on Easter night, her voice rising from wells, her shadow bending over the shoulders of children, whispering, "Never bow, never forget." The masters tried to bury the memory with ledgers and laws. But the land remembered. The well still stood, sealed with stone, the grass around it refusing to grow. On Pentecost nights, the fields fell unnaturally quiet, as though even the cicadas knew to keep silence. Travelers claimed that when the wind blew across the swamp, it carried not the cry of birds but the groan of drowning men. Dinah's story never reached the books of history, but it lived in whispers, in graves without names, in the scars of those who carried her memory. For the enslaved, she was not madness. She was proof that blood could answer blood, that the whip could break, that the earth itself could rise against its masters. And so, long after soldiers crushed the revolt, long after the fields were replanted, long after the masters died in their beds, the story remained, not as comfort, not as hope, but as warning. The oppressed remember, and when the earth has drunk enough, it will demand its due. Dinah was gone, yet not gone. She was the shadow at the edge of the swamp, the whisper in the hymn, the silence around the well, and in that silence, the future trembled. The story should have ended with Dinah's disappearance into the swamp, but it did not. What the masters buried in silence, the land itself carried forward. In the years after the Pentecost revolt, the plantation was rebuilt, fields replanted, the great house whitewashed, as if blood could be scrubbed away with lime. To passing travelers, it looked unchanged, a southern estate standing proud in Georgia soil. But those who lived on the land, those who bent their backs in the cotton rows, knew better. Something remained. The well was the first sign. No matter how many stones they laid across its mouth, water seeped up, black and sour, refusing to stay hidden. Horses shied from it, dogs howled at its edge, and slaves whispered prayers when passing. Overseers ordered buckets drawn from other creeks, swearing the well was cursed. Children, too young to understand, said they heard voices bubbling up from its throat at night, screams that never faded, whispers that begged for breath. The masters dismissed it as superstition, but their sleep betrayed them. Night after night they woke in terror, gasping from dreams of drowning. They dreamed of ropes tightening around their throats, of scarred hands pushing them into darkness. Some stopped sleeping altogether, their eyes red and hollow. Others drank themselves into stupors, but the dreams came anyway. The swamp too carried Dinah's mark. Hunters claimed to see a figure moving through the mist, a woman with a bent back and glowing eyes. She walked barefoot across water that swallowed others whole. One swore he heard her voice whispering his name before he stumbled into quicksand and vanished. For weeks after, no man dared hunt in that corner of the swamp. Among the enslaved, the whispers of Dinah became more than memory. They became ritual. On Easter nights, women gathered at the edge of the fields, humming low songs, their voices barely above the croak of frogs. Children were told her story before they were told the Lord's Prayer. When the whip cracked, when masters strutted proud, slaves whispered Dinah's name like a shield, and yet the fear spread not just among the oppressed but among the oppressors. White planters in nearby counties refused to hire overseers for that estate. They said too many drowned, too many vanished, too many came back shaking with tales of shadows in the night. The plantation bled money, its rows half-tended, its workers restless. Eventually the house was abandoned, left to rot under vines and moss. But Dinah's story did not die there. In towns and taverns, white men muttered of the witch of the well, a demon woman who dragged men to watery graves. They twisted her rebellion into nightmare, warning their children never to wander alone on Easter nights. Yet even in their lies, they could not erase her name. For the black community, Dinah was not a demon. She was a prophet. Preachers, in secret, wove her tale into sermons. The Lord sent Moses to the water, they would say, and he sent Dinah too. Both brought down pharaohs. Her defiance became gospel, not written in scripture, but in scars and whispered prayers. Decades later, When the Civil War broke the back of slavery, soldiers marching through Georgia heard the story still. Freedmen told Union troops of Dinah's vengeance, of the well that had swallowed Master's whole. Some soldiers laughed, but others rode wide around the swamp, unwilling to test whether the whispers were true. Even after freedom, the land remembered. The ruins of the plantation sank into weeds, the well overgrown with ivy, but locals swore no crop grew strong on that soil. Cotton wilted, corn rotted in the stalks, the ground itself seemed poisoned. Farmers avoided it, leaving it to snakes and silence, and so the legend endured. Generations passed, yet the tale was told in kitchens, on porches, in hushed tones when storms rattled the windows. On Easter she drowned 3, they would say. On Pentecost she drowned the Master. Children leaned close to the fire, wide-eyed, as their elders whispered, "If you listen by the water, you can still hear him scream." Dinah's name never reached the history books. It was never carved on stone or printed in ink. But in the mouths of the forgotten, in the soil of Georgia, in the echo of chains that never fully broke, her story lived. Not as myth, not as comfort, as warning, because every lash, every sail, every prayer forced through clenched teeth had left a mark on the land, and when the earth had drunk enough, it had risen. Through Dinah it had spoken. Through Dinah it had promised that blood will always answer blood, and somewhere deep in the swamp, when the mist coils low and the frogs fall silent, a shadow still walks, barefoot, scarred, silent, carrying the memory of all who refused to bow. That shadow is Dinah, and the land still listens to her footsteps.